Okay, let's get started. Welcome. I'm Jennifer and I'm your instructor for Introduction to Sociology, SOCH 1016. This is Week 1, Chapter 1. The purpose of the chapter in this textbook and the purpose of this course, this class, is to just familiarize you with the subject of sociology. We're going to introduce you to what sociology is, what it's all about, a sociological perspective. So don't be intimidated if you've never studied anything to do with sociology before. Don't be intimidated flipping through the textbook, looking ahead, looking at what's to come, terms, concepts, theories. I plan to introduce you to Soch in as simple and clear and uncomplicated a manner as possible, because it doesn't need to be complicated. Absolutely. There's going to be some terms or concepts or theories or ideas that you might have a little difficulty with at first. You're going to have to really think about them. But as we proceed through the course, you'll see that there's certain things I like to do to increase students' understanding. I don't just want you to memorize what's in the textbook and spit it back on a test or an assignment. I like to encourage students to really think about what they're studying and actually understand it. So one of the things I like to do is I always like to reword what I'm saying in more than one way, to rephrase it in a manner different than in the textbook. And I use what I like to call everyday words. If you think what the purpose of a textbook is, in my opinion, it's to increase the understanding of the reader. So with this in mind, I don't understand why often when you read a textbook, it seems to be written in as complicated and in as academic a manner as possible, because that doesn't increase people's understanding. I find if I can rephrase what we're studying in, again, what I call everyday words, that then when a student looks back at the academic terminology, they're like, oh, that makes sense. It just simplifies things. Something else I like to do is I like to provide a lot of examples that I feel students are likely to be able to relate to. And I do this whether I'm online or in an actual classroom. So I provide as many examples as I can, well, not as many as I can think of, but I try to provide several that I think will be effective in helping students understand what we're talking about. I apologize if you see the mouse move around at the bottom. If my cat goes to hop across me, I pause the presentation. So I like to provide a lot of examples. And then I'm going to make a recommendation to you that might sound kind of odd coming from the instructor, but it really does go along with what I've just said. And that is, if you're having difficulty understanding something, whether it's a small part of something bigger or the big thing, the theory, I'm actually going to recommend that you go to YouTube and search it. There are a whole series of videos on YouTube about sociology as well as other disciplines that people have created. Some were created by high school teachers, some by college or university professors, some have been created by students who have had to complete a video as part of an assignment. They're usually not very long, but really effective in helping to explain things, like I just said. I find the videos are particularly useful for summarizing a subject. So you get to the end of a theory, and then you go to YouTube and watch a quick video about maybe functionalism, and it kind of pulls it all together. I didn't grow up with YouTube. I didn't grow up with the internet. I'm almost 50. So I am continuously amazed and shocked in a positive way at the variety of things you can find on YouTube. They're not just for fun, but actually very, very useful. Again, they phrase things in a different way, which is useful. And overall, the hundreds and hundreds of students I've had contact with have told me that they find the educational videos on YouTube to be a very good aid in helping them understand material. So I'm recommending that you go to YouTube and search things. Now, when you read the very beginning of chapter 1, the author tells you how he himself became interested in sociology. So he tells you that he never studied it before, and here he is several years later having written a textbook about it. And because of that, many people in many ways regard him as kind of an authority in sociology. Now, you might never write a textbook about Soc. I've never written a textbook about Soc, and I have no intention of doing so. But by the end of this course, you will have a very good understanding of the subject overall. You'll be comfortable having a conversation about it. And you'll probably begin to take on a sociological perspective in your everyday life, which will make sense in a little bit. You're going to start to kind of see sociology in your everyday life. And I know that sounds hokey, but it's true. So, for example, about a month ago, I was in an airport waiting to take a flight back home, and it was very, very crowded. There were hundreds and hundreds of people in this one place, and all everybody wanted to do was get checked in and go through security as quickly as possible. But the computer system at the airport had been down for a couple hours, and even though it was back up, you had this backlog of people. So checking in took about 3 hours. And then after that, we waited for our flight for about 4 hours because there was a problem with the plane. And then we were told that it was canceled and rescheduled for the next day. They actually needed a new front tire for the plane, as odd as that sounds. Needless to say, nobody was happy. They were aggravated, and absolutely so was I. I just wanted to get home. But at the same time, as I sat there, I was very, very aware of how things were happening around me, how people interacted with each other and affected each other, how they interacted with the airport staff and how the staff and the people affected each other, how people were generally affected by the atmosphere of the airport. So in other words, I was looking at it from a sociological perspective. Now, I tend to slip into that mindset probably more easily than you because I talk about this stuff all the time. But still, I guarantee that by the end of the course, you're going to be able to understand a sociological perspective, and you'll find yourself slipping into it very often. For example, I find when I'm online, the MSN homepage is like a trap. You go online to get some work done, and you see that, and you just start reading. Regularly on the MSN homepage, I'll see articles, and I think, oh, that reminds me of this course. Oh, that reminds me of that course. So whether you want to or not, you're going to find that that's going to happen to you by the end of the course. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about sociology. And I actually quite like this definition because it's very clear and straightforward and short. Sociology itself is the systematic study of human behavior in a social context. Very, very straightforward. So we don't just look at individual people. It's always within the context of society, and that is key. I like to provide to students that kind of summary as a very, very simple distinction between sociology and psych. We always look at them within the context of society. So I'm going to give you a really, really simple analogy that might seem almost too simplistic to explain this, but sometimes the simple examples are the most effective. I want you to picture a fish in a bowl on a counter. You can name him if you like. And you're supposed to study this fish from a sociological perspective. What this means then is you don't just study the fish itself. You study the fish in the environment they are in, within the context of the bowl, within the context of their world or their society. So, how is the fish affected by the shape of the bowl, by the size of the bowl, by where the bowl is placed in a room? How is the fish affected by how much sunlight the bowl does or does not receive? By what's in the bowl with the fish, whether there's plastic plants or real plants, or those little colored rocks you see at the bottom of an aquarium sometimes, or I don't know, a fake little pirate ship to swim in and out of. How is the fish affected by the water? By how often the water is cleaned, the temperature of the water, whether it's tap water or purified water. How often the water is how the water moves around, like if it has something in it to make the water move around. So we would look at whether there's other fish in the bowl, how they interact, how they affect each other. And with all of the examples I've just given, we would then flip them and look at how the fish affects all of those issues. And this is what sociology does. It studies the way people act within the context of the society they live in. Now, absolutely, we might look at an individual. We might study someone in a small group or maybe in a family. We might study somebody in a large group or an entire community, maybe even an entire society. But the important thing is it's always studied within the context of society. How does society interact with and affect human behavior? How does human behavior interact with and affect society? Now, in the textbook, this is a direct quote: "The organization of the social world opens up some opportunities and closes others." This might sound a little philosophical to you, and I understand that, but it makes a lot of sense. What this means is that the structure of the society we live in, the social structure, will in many ways determine what we can and can't do. In a way, it regulates our life. And you probably don't think of yourself and the choices you make being determined by the social institutions in your society, especially routine day in, day out living. But it's true. And this would be true no matter which society we were looking at. So, of course, I'm going to use Canadian society as an example because we're Canadian and that's where we are. In our society, we have several social structures or social institutions, and I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. Some of them we can physically see or at least see evidence of, and some we can't. And what these social structures do is they keep our society going. They regulate Canadian society, how it operates and how everybody interacts. And in doing this, they provide stability for Canada, for everybody as individuals, and for society as a whole. So I'm going to give you some examples. The government is a social structure that in many ways determines how our society functions on a daily basis, as well as on a long-term basis. And the government in every society does the same. The education system is another example of a social institution or social structure that regulates our society. It determines what Canadian children should learn in a systematic, routine manner every year. It determines how best to teach them, how best to evaluate them. Our healthcare system is another example. Our legal system is a social structure. Now, you can physically see parts of these social structures. So you can see schools and teachers. You can see government buildings. You can see hospitals and doctors. You can see a courthouse or a jail, and you can read the law. And if I were to ask you what these were, you could probably explain them pretty easily. If I asked you, what is the education system? Your answer would be something like, the system that teaches all of our children in the same way. We can easily define this social structure. We have a clear understanding of it. But there's other social structures, social institutions, that do the same thing, that help to maintain society, to regulate it, to keep it going. But they're not as easily defined, and you can't always see physical evidence of them. For example, religion. As a whole, religion is a social structure that contributes to determining the way our society is, how it runs, how it operates us, it regulates society. Now, we won't be studying religion specifically in this course, but there is a chapter about religion in the textbook if you want to take a look at it. Religion used to have a much, much larger role in Canadian society, but over time it has receded, it has declined. If you think when the French and the English first came to what's now known as Canada, religion really was a major linchpin holding society together that had a direct and immediate effect on daily life. Now, the role of religion has declined. It's not as big an influence for the majority of people. It continues to be a major social structure in Canadian society, but its role is not quite as prominent as it once was. Culture is a social structure, a social institution that people sometimes have a little bit of difficulty defining. Now, the definition in the textbook for culture is a little long. It defines culture as the socially transmitted practices, languages, symbols, beliefs, values, ideologies, and material objects that people create to deal with real life problems. It sounds a little bit complicated. It really isn't. And we'll be looking at culture in Chapter 2 of the textbook, so you'll gain a much, much better understanding of it then. Culture is a social structure that we can sometimes see evidence of, but it's also something that for many of us, we just feel it just is. We feel it, we experience it. Not necessarily something people have an easy time defining. And especially when it comes to Canadian culture, I enjoy discussing with students what is Canadian culture, because we tend to have a difficult time defining our own culture. And then I'll ask them, well, what do you think is the difference between Canadian culture and American culture? And we often have an especially difficult time with that question. And as a last example of a main social structure in Canadian society, that's what the concept of a family is. A family, our concept of family, is a social institution. This is the subject of Chapter 9 in the textbook. And as that chapter points out, now in Canada, we have many different kinds of families that are not only socially accepted, but legally recognized. So, of course, you start out with a nuclear family with a man and a woman, at least living together, if not legally married, with at least one child. We have extended families, step families, blended families, families with same-sex parents. The key here is that no matter what specific form it takes, the family as a social institution acts to keep our society going, to keep it stable, to keep it strong. The family as a concept generally acts as one of the foundations of our society. Now, how do these great big social structures interact with Canadians on an individual level? How do they affect you and regulate everybody else, whether we realize that's what's going on or not? I'm going to use marriage as an example because, again, that's something everybody has some familiarity with. In Canada, we all have the freedom. So yes, I'm just repeating here that we study in part the social structures that provide stable patterns of social relations. So we're studying how these big social structures provide stability for society overall and how they provide stability in terms of how we interact with each other. As we go through these slideshow presentations, it'll be just like in class. I've unfortunately quickly realized that I can't make them absolutely perfect, that I might stumble over my words a bit. I might go forward a bit when I shouldn't. I might not go forward quick enough, just like I would in class. So please be understanding with that. I can't make everything perfect. Marriage. Okay. How does this regulate you? Like I said, in Canada, we have the freedom to marry who we want. Yes, a person may feel very pressured by their family to marry a certain person, or they may feel very pressured not to marry a certain person. But in Canada, it's not only legally recognized, it's a social expectation, a social norm that people marry who they want. But it hasn't always been this way. For example, same-sex marriage was not legalized in Canada until 2005. So prior to that, the law prohibited or restricted or regulated what people as individuals could do regarding marriage. The legal system, which is one of the social structures in our society, directly regulated another social institution. The family. It affected who people could legally start a family with. Now, I also want to point out that even though we have the freedom to marry who we want to, we are actually still restricted, even though most of us don't think of it, because we're so used to it. So, what am I talking about? For example, in Canada, you cannot marry a close blood relative like a brother or a sister. An aunt can't marry her nephew, an uncle can't marry his niece. And you're probably thinking, of course, Jennifer, you can't. But the fact is, this law regulates your life and everybody else. Now, because not marrying a blood relative is a widely accepted social norm, it's something that is so firmly ingrained in Canadian society that nobody even begins to think about it. We don't think of it regulating us, but the fact is, it does. As other examples, in Canada, we have the freedom to attend any school we want to. Now, of course, the cost would factor into this. But people do not have that freedom in every country. In some countries, the school you attend, for example, might depend on whether you're male or female. And if you're female, you wouldn't even have the opportunity to be educated. In Canadian society, we have the freedom to travel where we want to. We don't have to apply to the government for permission to move to a different area of the country. Or even if we simply wanted to travel to a different part of Canada. If I wanted to hop in a car right now and drive out to see my brother in Edmonton, I could just do that. If I wanted to buy a ticket to Halifax or to Yellowknife and go, I could just do that. But people don't have that freedom in every country. In some countries, the government and the legal system monitors their travel and controls their travel. It used to be that way in Canada for First Nations people. They would have to ask for permission to travel or to leave their reserve. So large-scale social structures in Canadian society, such as the government, such as the legal system, regulate individuals, and by doing this, these social structures stabilize patterns of social relations.